Thanks for choosing the best after lunch panel. I'm Greg. I'm Greg Dalton, and I host the Climate One podcast and radio show based at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. Delighted to be here with these experts for an engaging discussion. We want to get a read on the room in terms of who's in the room. Just if we could have people just say kind of what sector you're in. We just want to know who we're talking to. Raise a hand, and I'll just call on you, like what, just so we know what level of area people are coming from. Who's going to be first?
We want to do categories. Finance.
Life sciences.
Life sciences. Okay. What else?
Finance.
Finance. Lots of finance. Energy. Okay. Do you guys know? Environment. Okay. Finance, life sciences, energy, investment. Okay. Great. Thanks for that.
Policy.
The break. Government. Yes. Yes, sir. Okay, so investors. All right, good. That's very helpful. Thank you. Well, here we have all these people are probably on Facebook, so I won't do that. But Kathy Zoe will soon be the CEO of SunEdison's Rural Electric Company, and is currently director of the Energy Transformation Collaborative at Stanford. She's been in government. She's been on the investor side. Ian Wright is the CEO of Wrightspeed, and he's a co-founder of Tesla. He's really into the power and speed of electric cars. You can ask him if he can get you a discount. And then Scott Jacobs is CEO and co-founder of Generate Capital. He co-founded McKinsey's clean energy practice and also has been in government. So a real strong group for us here today. The title of this was Peak Oil and Green Energy, both fossils. So Scott, I'd like to start with you and talk about the connection between oil prices and clean energy and what's real and what's not so real there.
So I think a lot of folks have seen the commodity price decline over the last 6 months, and if you're at all paying attention to the markets, what is interesting is that many folks have also made the conclusion that the decline in commodity prices has something to do with electricity prices in the United States. It does not. It hasn't for many years, and make no mistake about it, let us debunk that myth today. Oil prices at $50 or $100, either one, will have zero impact on what you pay for the electricity coming out of the wall. We diverged a long time ago here in the United States, setting with the marginal price of electricity being set by oil or gas. Natural gas obviously has a major impact on electricity prices here in the U.S., but they diverge. Those natural gas prices, as many of you know, diverged from oil many years ago with the advent of unconventional sources of natural gas. And so it's just amazing to me that people think either electricity companies or renewable electricity companies should be hurt by a lower commodity price for oil. And that's something hopefully we can address today if anyone has any questions about it. But we should at least set that baseline that that's not the way the world works.
Ian Wright, does cheap oil hurt Tesla?
I don't think that's why people buy Teslas. Have you driven one?
I have. It's exhilarating, and yeah, most Tesla buyers don't worry about the price of gas. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's not why they buy them. They buy them because they're really, really nice cars. They like the fact that they're clean, but they're not really buying them to save money. They're $100,000. For the stuff that we make, though, into commercial vehicles, it is exactly that. You're selling to the CFO, you're offsetting the cost of oil to drive the trucks, the cost of electricity and batteries. So yes, makes a difference.
So there is some connection with clean tech and oil prices, but in a lot of places it gets conflated, and clean tech stocks get hammered for reasons that some people don't really understand. Kathy, peak oil, that was one of the questions frames for this discussion. Is peak oil dead with fracking?
Well, I think famously there was a former oil minister of Saudi Arabia who said the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. I don't think the same is going to be true here. I mean, we have better energy technologies that perform well, that are comfortable, that are cost effective, and that that enhance our environment. Those technologies are quickly replacing our reliance on oil. So it's good. So I think the framing is wrong. The peak oil issue is not a big one anymore, and we have the rise of unconventional sources means that we do have abundant supplies, but they'll probably just stay in the ground.
And well, there's some very powerful companies who want to get it out of the ground and burn it, but there's a debate whether those assets need to stay in the ground to stabilize the climate at a certain level. So how will they stay in the ground if they're valuable and the world's demanding them?
Well, I mean, we just heard 3 former Treasury secretaries agree that one of the most pressing issues to the global economy is to address climate change. And those weren't environmentalists. Those were Treasury secretaries. And I mean, I actually had the privilege of working in the Clinton White House when Bob Rubin was the head of the National Economic Council. And I can remember those early days and him beginning to understand, oh my goodness, this is indeed a really, really important issue. And he's now become one of the most important advocates for taking action urgently on this. So I think the markets will adjust as we actually need to, as a global economy, for economic and environmental and security reasons, need to rely on a different set of technologies.
That was pretty amazing to hear those 3 Treasury secretaries give that sort of universal endorsement of the importance and urgency of climate change for financial markets. Scott, the one way that's going to happen potentially is the revaluation. What does that mean for fossil fuel companies and their valuations?
Yeah, I mean, we take a broad perspective on energy and resources, and you look over the last 150 years. I mean, we just heard the Treasury secretaries also talk about productivity growth and how that's been the engine for economic development. And you look at the last sort of 3 major shifts in the economy: the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and the digital revolution. They're really all about the productivity of the individual incremental worker. With drones and artificial intelligence and software, I'm not sure we even need another worker. So that raises big questions about what will supply the economy and what will supply the productivity growth that we need to see in the economy when labor is no longer the hardest nut to crack, if you will, or the hardest problem to solve. So we believe a resource revolution is underway, where it's actually all about the other inputs to the economy that are costly and volatile and often precious, or at least very environmentally sensitive. Energy, food, water, materials, land, and air have not seen the same sort of productivity growth that we've seen over the last 150 years. And as a result, it creates a major disruption or set of dislocations, or any other consultancy or business lingo speak that someone has on the New York Times bestseller list. The bottom line is there are fundamental shifts in the valuations of all of these energy and resources companies that are underway and that will continue as this resource revolution continues, where we use these resources more effectively. In other words, we have higher efficiency or higher productivity with respect to these resources. The roads, for example, in the United States alone are billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure investment, 4% utilization. Cars, the largest asset for every human, for most households, the most expensive asset for most households, 5% utilized, right? That is really poor capacity utilization, a terrible productivity statement about our economy, and we will figure out better ways to make more use of those assets. Similarly, we will see that the price of some of these other assets on balance sheets of companies like the fossil fuel companies get revalued in the opposite direction.
So they will go down. Sure.
Just Scott's talking about a vision for the future, but we've already seen evidence of the decoupling of economic growth from energy growth. I mean, when I was a little girl, they were tied, they were linked. If you wanted to have the economy grow, any analyst would say, well, look at what's happening to energy consumption. And they were linked. And the data is that between 1950 and 1990, electricity grew 6% per year in terms of demand. And then for the next 20 years, it dropped to about 1.9%. And in the past 5 years, there's been zero growth in electricity demand, and yet the economy still grows. So what Scott's talking about in the future is an even more enhanced resource revolution with digital materials and computing and all of the extra things that we can harvest out of this, so we can have growth without resource depletion.
I want to ask Ian. Scott just talked about valuations of companies. Tesla, $25 billion market cap, makes a few thousand cars. That seems to be an example of the market saying we really value this new technology. Is it overvalued?
No comment.
Do you still own shares?
Yeah, how much do you?
I do not.
Bummer.
Yeah.
Let's talk about other areas of innovation where we can make this happen. What's going to drive the innovation? It sounds like you're saying, Scott, that there's some factors at work that are going to drive this innovation. But still, where's the innovation going to happen on air, water, food, energy? What's going to drive that?
Well, I come from a technology background. I spent over a decade as an entrepreneur in software and then also as a VC. And I wish that that were perfectly applicable to the energy and resources equation that I undertook a career in about a decade ago. I naively, like many people in Silicon Valley, thought that we could just reinvent energy and resources and then we'd solve all these problems, whether it's the environmental problems you want to talk about or the fact that we spend most of our money defending sources of oil all around the globe. And the folks who receive a lot of funding from the US, thanks to their resources, often come back and don't like us very much. So if you think about those problems, obviously you get excited about it and you think about it from my point of view and you think, oh, technology can solve it. That's just patently false. And I fortunately realized the error in my own ways and realized this is an infrastructure problem, not an invention problem. Energy and resources are all about infrastructure. These are long-held assets. And there is no technology investor in the world that has a long enough time horizon to try and reinvent the energy equation. Except for maybe the government or a philanthropist, but that's not the commercial sources of capital that I tend to work in. And so you have to have too long a time horizon to really think about invention or reinvention of the energy and resources equation. However, what we can do and what we are doing is seeing a lot of business model innovation that doesn't take a fundamental reinvention of the physics, but actually just deploys some of the great innovations that we've been doing in a recombinatorial way for decades. Lots of incremental changes have happened, whether it's microchips or digital information or other things that have come together that now we can take advantage of in building new infrastructure, rebuilding the world rather than reinventing the world. And you can make a lot of money with these business model innovations like we've seen SunEdison pioneer, for example, where you have not someone coming up with a new solar array or some new solar cell, but actually just finding a better way to sell that electricity than people had been selling that electricity previously. And that was a business model innovation that frankly unlocked what was a less than $1 billion solar industry 10 years ago, and it's now a $150 billion a year industry and growing like mad.
And PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy, was another financial innovation that, Kathy, you're not at SunEdison yet, but it's a good example of business, financial innovation. We often think of technology innovation.
Absolutely. I mean, the yield co-creation has been a boon to both investors and to develop it. And that model, I mean, the company that I'm going to help build within SunEdison is basically going to take a bunch of little rural assets, underserved communities. There's 1.5 billion people without electricity in the world. There's another 1.5 billion that are underserved in terms of electricity, and apply innovative business models to getting them what makes good economic sense, which is renewable energy microgrids all around the planet. And again, it will create a real win-win. But what I did want to add to what the business model innovation perspective, and I was lucky when I was at the Department of Energy to oversee a really significant R&D budget. And I will say that while we are now cost competitive on so many of these new technologies, new-ish technologies, solar and wind and biofuels and geothermal, we continue to get better. We are still on really fun, interesting parts of the learning and experience curve, so that essentially when we apply Moore's Law to solar, we're still making a big, huge difference. I mean, when I was at the Department of Energy working with Steve Chu, we kicked off this program called the Sunshot, and the idea was to get to $1 a watt for $1 a watt installed for solar. And Steve and I had this fight about, I thought it could be 2017. He said, no, Kathy, we need it to be 2020. We were both wrong. It happened faster. And it's continuing to accelerate in terms of the cost coming down in markets around the world. And that sort of innovation is going to continue to take place. So we think about seeding that continued innovation in the technology side, whether it's batteries or LEDs or new permanent magnets in wind turbines or solar cells, and then applying it innovatively to models to get it to market and finance. And we're talking about a giant transformation.
Let's pick up on batteries, because energy storage is often talked about as a place where we need a breakthrough, and prices have not come down as fast as some other areas, Ian. Why not?
Well, you mentioned Moore's law, and people make that mistake. You know, it doesn't apply to batteries. Moore's law is all about the geometry of semiconductors. So there's, in a Tesla, there's nearly 1,000 pounds of fairly expensive raw materials in the battery pack. The raw material costs you can't do much about. In fact, if you scale up the production, that probably gets worse. And the next big problem is that it's immensely capital intensive to build a battery factory, and if you want twice as many batteries, it's twice as much capital. You have to amortize that over the life of the asset and the number of batteries you can make. It doesn't scale well. So all the things that you're used to for electronics that make it cheaper with volume and with time do not apply to batteries. And you know, when we started Tesla, we thought this through fairly carefully, and you know, Toyota or Honda can make a little 4-cylinder engine, a cheap one, for a few $100s, actually about $300. But the battery pack in a Tesla costs, you know, shouldn't say, but it's tens of thousands of dollars, and it's not ever going to get down to $300. Not ever. It's not even going to get close. It's not even going to get to 10 times that. So that's a fundamental problem that you have to overcome.
So that seems to be an area where it's either the economics are not going to come into play the way we'd like them to, that there needs to be a big breakthrough, which raises the question whether we have all the technology we need, it needs to be scaled or deployed, or new breakthrough innovations are needed.
Well, okay. So I'm an entrepreneur, and you know, we started Tesla in 2003, and at the time we said, well, we'll use laptop batteries because they're already starting down the experience curve, and they're cheap now, and they get a lot cheaper. So we had some guesses about how much cheaper they would get, and by now, that hasn't happened. Didn't even get close. We've seen at Tesla at Lightspeed, we've seen every battery startup and new technology you can imagine. You know, they all pitch to us. And I've become very cynical about them. Until they can actually put a cell in my lab and I can test it, I just don't even bother. Because 99% of them, it just never happens. They can't get them to production, they don't have a cycle life, they can't get the cost there, there's always some problem. There have been some big improvements since we started Tesla. You know, the high power batteries that we use, A123 make them, and then the lithium titanate ones, they let you build quite small battery packs at extremely high power. We put 1,000 horsepower into garbage trucks, and that's 52 kilowatt hour battery pack. That power level has gone so far up, and that lets you run a range extended EV power architecture, and that lets you get a lot of use out of the batteries, extract a lot more value out of them in the life of the vehicle. So we've got big increases in power and in lifetime, but in terms of driving the cost down for a mile driven in an EV, it hasn't really happened.
Yeah, I would say I would not like the audience to be left with the feeling, the sense that we're not on a good experience curve, a good part of the learning curve, because what my colleagues tell me, and my colleagues at Stanford tell me, and my colleagues, you know, like Steve Chu and Arun Majumdar, who are thinking about a lot of these things and are making investments, is they would have a decidedly more bullish view than you, and they may be wrong and you may be right, but I think that there's not an agreement that we're sort of stuck and we're not going to be able to get there. I mean, even Elon Musk is talking about more bullish numbers on lithium ion than you are.
Sure, but he's scoured the world trying to buy those, and what is he doing about it?
Well, he's building a gigafactory.
He's building a gigafactory because it's not going to happen otherwise.
But it's all right. He's building a gigafactory to provide cost-effective batteries for his cars, and he's going to sell a car for $35,000. And he's not going to sell a car for $35,000 if the battery's going to cost $25,000.
Well, you know, the plan was to sell a car for $30,000 back in 2003, and they're still selling for $100 grand.
Let's let the record show that we have a disagreement.
Good. Well, hopefully we'll get some more here. Scott, you were involved in seeding some battery companies, and the U.S. had seeded battery innovation and sort of manufacturing for many years to Asia. A little bit happening here in the United States. Maybe the gigafactory is going to be a milestone in that area. Is this a place where the U.S. can lead? And do you think we need breakthroughs, or can we just need to scale what's already there?
So just for the record, I have not invested in any battery company, and I don't intend to. And that answers the question to a certain extent, which is whether or not, you know, it makes sense to invest in battery companies to get a risk-adjusted return that you like as an investor. For me, it doesn't. Maybe for the government, it could, and for the government, it did, in the form of the stimulus package that helped save our economy from a total collapse in 2009. I would say, however, that most of the things that people associate with clean technologies are really just industrial or energy technologies. And most of the people that make industrial or energy technologies today are not in the US, and they haven't been for a long time. And so, Detroit has come back to a certain extent, obviously, but the industrial economy in the United States is actually not perfectly competitive. We lose every time, pretty much, to places like China and Japan and Korea, even Germany, where discrete manufacturing has a decided advantage over here, in part because of the talent base, in part because of other factors. So all of that is to say, I don't expect lithium-ion batteries or advanced batteries in general to necessarily come out of the U.S. when we see, the next step up in performance or, energy density or whatever. It's likely not to come from the U.S. We don't have most of the fundamental innovation here anymore. And most of the innovation that happens in these kinds of technologies actually happens when you're actually manufacturing the stuff. It's process improvements, it's experience curve effects, rather than, again, that revolutionary step function change in the physics.
Let's talk about capital flows, where the money's going to come for this innovation. VCs got burned. They kind of swaggered into the clean tech saloon and said, all right, guys, let me tell you. And then they kind of got roughed up a little bit and kicked out of that saloon. So where is the money coming from? You're very keen on peer-to-peer lending, non-bank lending. Is that where the real money's going to come from? And what's the role for VCs?
I think in general we're seeing a lot of new innovation in the financial markets, and we have to. Financial markets are stuck, and they're regulated so that they're going to be more stuck, right? And so non-bank lenders, whether it's Lending Club or others, have emerged to fill a major gap where people need money, whether it's a loan or equity, and the traditional capital markets are not satisfying that need. Venture capital has always gotten a lot of the attention, especially here in our little bubble in California, and in particular in my even smaller bubble in Northern California, where we think that all of the innovation capital in the world is located, which is first of all not true, and secondly, the energy and resource markets are global markets. And so it's not coming all out of Silicon Valley. In fact, very little of it's coming out of Silicon Valley. And in fact, even the numbers, at its peak, VC funding was $8 billion for energy-related innovation in a total, total energy funding world of over $300 billion a year, so tiny, tiny, tiny fraction and that's, by the way, in just clean energy, $300 billion a year for the last 7 years. And at its peak, VC was 8. And then if you look at energy as a whole, you're talking about trillions of dollars of capital flows. So VC just doesn't matter, and that's despite the
somebody tweet that, please. Okay. Kathy?
Yeah, so the capital for what is what I would say. So the capital for R&D, I think a lot of the capital for early stage R&D ought to comes from the government now. It ought to come from the government in larger amounts. I mean, I think you have. There have been a series of studies over the past 5 years with eminent business people, former politicians of high repute, believe it or not, both parties agreeing that we are underinvesting in energy R&D in this country, right? By a lot. If you compare the amount of R&D that goes into the energy sector to pharmaceuticals or other sectors, energy is well under invested in. So R&D early stage stuff would come from government. Venture, again, I think we could, Scott and I can sort of debate back and forth. Is there a role for venture capital in energy? In capital light technologies and businesses, probably so, because it's a little bit less messy, it's a little bit shorter of a gestation period.
But what's capital light in energy and resources?
Software
Efficiency.
controls, sensors.
Building efficiency, software.
We both know a software company that's raised hundreds of millions of dollars in the energy space. And even just pick Workday, which is a software as a service company, right? Which is theoretically capital light, because it's literally a software as a service company, right? That's supposed to be the definition of capital light. How much money did it raise before it went public? Does anyone know? A lot of money.
What do you call it?
It's like 80-something million dollars. That's not a capital light business either. There are very few capital light businesses, and VCs like to claim, oh, let's do something capital light because then my money has a higher multiplier. But that's just analytically inconsistent with the reality of the world, and I think it's important for us to be a little bit more intellectually honest.
Did Google overpay for Nest? I mean, is a thermostat capital intensive?
Well, I mean, at the risk of seeming like an idiot, I passed on a round a few months prior to it at $2 billion valuation, so I made my bet at the time, and I'm wrong. Well, I'm wrong a lot.
We'll see how Nest plays out for Google, but yeah.
But then for the later stage stuff, All right, so you've got sort of venture, which again, we can argue where that money comes from, and maybe it comes from other sources for that earlier stage development. Once you get to something that is a proven technology, and you've got innovative business models, and you've got companies like SunEdison, project finance comes into play, public markets come into play, and there's a lot of capital available for that. And it's all about the risk return. So I think what we're talking about here, and again, this what seems to maybe be a giant disagreement between Scott and me on the role of venture in this stuff is not necessarily a giant disagreement, because it is a relatively, it's an important part of the system development chain of energy technologies, but it's not, it's partially like the tail of the dog is not the whole dog.
Ian, you're on the raising side of this. How are you
Yeah.
seeking to fund?
Right.
You're on the raising side of this. Where do you see the money coming from?
Oh, yes, I spent a lot of time doing that.
They throwing it at you?
No, it's very hard, and it's become harder in the clean tech stuff, very hard. We've raised money from super angels, we've raised money from venture capitalists, we've raised money from the government, California Energy Commission loans, grants I mean. We've applied for Department of Energy loans, haven't ever had one. We've now had investors that are customers and suppliers. And I think for us going forward now, there's a lot more of that. The customers, a lot of them are getting quite smart about strategic investing, and they have little venture arms. And if you're doing something that they think is innovative and it's going to be valuable to their business and strategic, then there are quite good sources of capital there. As an entrepreneur, I'd say that I probably spend well over 50% of my time raising money, and have done for the entire time of the company. And it's very frustrating, and that intellectual energy could be better spent. So I don't know, all sources would be better. We don't spend a lot on building technology in this country, we don't.
Let's talk a little bit about, so you mentioned earlier, the water, food, all these things are connected. There's a lot of embedded energy in these issues. We want to talk about other things, food, water, et cetera, because that's also, there's a question whether ag tech is the new clean tech, right? That ag tech is very trendy in Silicon Valley right now. Is that going to be kind of just a repeat, a sequel, a bad sequel to the clean tech chapter?
It's a very good question, and I don't know the answer, but if it follows the same pattern that it followed before, which is a bunch of IT retreads like me, trying to invest in hard asset infrastructure, incumbent-led world, it's got disaster written all over it. You have to invest in an industry, especially in VC. You have to know the industry. You have to know the customers. You have to be a value-added investor by helping your companies find great leadership and great customers and make deals and whatnot. And you fundamentally can't do that if you have never been in the agriculture industry. You've only been in the IT industry. The other thing I would just add, though, is that ag to me looks a lot like energy and water and those markets, where it's very hard to imagine a small amount of money going into a small team of a few people that within a small amount of time turns into big revenue and big margin. And that's the formula for a successful venture capital investment. It's not even that one of those criteria doesn't apply to energy, it's that all of those criteria don't apply in the energy space. And I think they probably don't apply in the ag space, although I'm just not well-versed enough to know. I do think you're right that these resources are overlapping, and it is something, when I was advising a lot of pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, that we talked a lot about, this risk that is pervasive across asset classes, sectors, and geographies. When you think about energy issues, those issues are not just energy issues. They're water issues, they're food issues, they're land issues. And yet, as an investor, the allocators often say, okay, you're just an energy person. Just do energy. And by the way, don't just do energy, just do energy in North America. Oh, and by the way, don't just do energy in North America, just do private equity. Oh, and not just private equity, but $50 million at a time. Right? And so then you're like in this tiny little field, which is great because you're specialized, you know how to do that $50 million deal, but that person who's doing that $50 million deal might be the best person in the world for CalPERS to have looking at a water deal in California, but they're not allowed. And that's part of what the system change we need, involves in the capital markets. We have a whole screwed up capital market system when it comes to long-term assets with risks that spread across sectors, geographies. I mean, we saw this with the financial crisis in 2008. Is anyone really still under the assumption that we can have uncorrelated asset classes, sectors, and geographies with risks that spread across them? I don't think so, but we seem to continue doing what we just did and saw pretty big problems from.
Institutions, educational systems, there's a lot that sort of reinforce that specialization.
Well, I also
Kathy,
think one of the other challenges that we've got with the water, food, bringing that into the nexus, the so-called nexus, is that water in most markets is underpriced. And so that makes it really, really difficult to invest in. I mean, there's giant externalities that are not accurately reflected because it's an essential service, and politically it's darn near impossible to raise water prices. So that's hard. I think similarly, when you're talking about seeds and other ag innovations, you know, the other added complexity, of course, with food is the distributed nature of how food gets done and made. And so I think it's if we thought energy was hard and messy for the traditional capitalist investment community, I think the food water nexus makes it even more complex.
Just try to talk about a culture class too, with the agricultural culture of food production being very different, and I'm just trying to imagine that going in there. But in terms of energy poverty, Kathy Zoe, you're going to be working on around the world trying to get people connected to who are not connected. Is that going to be a big market segment? But those are people that don't have a lot of money to pay for that energy.
Well, what's so fascinating about today, and you know, I've been in this sector for nearly 30 years, is that the unit economics are now good enough so that people who are in rural areas who are not connected to the grid, if their current energy supply is intermittent diesel, then solar can beat it in most places, and that's the new thing. And so we can actually work in you know, the company that I'm starting to build. Again, it's got dozens of people around the world across SunEdison that are working in India and Senegal and Tanzania on microgrids and solar water pumping, and they're creating a service for people in little village economies where those people are better off economically with having a renewable power source.
So solar is competitive today.
Today.
And not just island nations that are isolated.
No. This is sort of, you know, in places in Rajasthan, you know, where they're actually using diesel. They had formerly been using diesel pumping in the salt flats. In Tamil Nadu, similarly, you know, where they actually have intermittent. They are connected to the grid, but it's such a bad intermittent supply that they don't get to pump most of the time. Or the electricity is on at night, so they have to pump their fields at night, which makes no sense. So solar competes with that sort of service.
Scott, you were involved in the Recovery Act, which helped solar. I mean, China and Germany, the German consumers, thank you very much, helped create a public good by paying some high prices. You're a fan of, excited about the new generation coming online that's solar these days. It's the best story around is solar.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at the curves of prices for conventional versus renewables, and it's an X, right? Sort of like supply and demand. Would you rather be betting on the thing that's going down in cost, or would you rather be betting on the thing that's going up in cost?
Well, oil's way down, but we're not going to conflate transportation and electricity, but some oil has been down. So not all fossil fuels have been going up.
That's right, but we're, again, not necessarily talking about fossil fuels, but I think the extraction costs of getting new oil out of the ground, right, et cetera, has gone up. Every incremental new supply of oil is more expensive than the last. And that's true outside of the United States, basically everywhere. But I think the bigger point is one that Kathy made, which is that it's just plain better. I mean, these communities of people are using a cleaner version of energy that is cheaper, more reliable, more modular, just plain better. And so that's true across a lot of these energy and resource areas. That's the resource revolution I was talking about. That's why, you know, when we were at McKinsey, we did all this work for people. It wasn't because people were paying us out of altruism to like make themselves feel better. It was to find billions of dollars of profit by making millions of dollars of investments. And hundreds of clients did it every year in something you guys would call sustainability. And, you know, that's a big deal. Sustainability only matters because it's economical now, right? It's a big deal because it's just better business if you take these measures that reduce your costs, reduce your risks, and increase your profits. I mean, we're all here, I think we all know those things.
Kathy Zoya?
Well, look, no, I agree. I mean, and I think actually the increasing cost that Scott's talking about it is true with coal empirically, and whether it's not because of the same sort of
people are not investing in coal.
Well,
in the efficiency,
it's not the
right?
same thing as we're going down the learning curve. It's sort of like we've tapped out on the learning curve with coal, and meanwhile we've now realized that there are some problems with coal. So the practical notion of trying to get a new coal plant sited in America, it's really, really darn near impossible. I mean, we've shut down 25 gigawatts we've retired 25 gigawatts of coal, so that's 25 or somewhere between 25 and 50 major power plants in the past 5 years. We've got another 38 gigawatts of coal plants that are slated to come offline between now and 2025 because they're old, they're thumping, they make pollution, they make mercury, they're too expensive to fix and make clean, and so guess what, and there are other alternatives. So the costs of coal are increasing while the costs of solar and wind are decreasing, and you've got, it's really, so that's the major sort of driver that's pushing all of this.
And it's importantly not getting that much cheaper to build a combined cycle natural gas plant from a capital expense standpoint, right? Yeah, the commodity prices have come down, although they've been about the same for the last 8 years.
Capital's cheap, though.
Capital's cheap, but it's still hundreds of millions of dollars to build a facility, and I can spend literally $10,000 and power this room, at least. With, the minimum efficient scale for delivering these resources has come down literally multiple orders of magnitude over the last several decades. Multiple orders of magnitude. 25 years ago, in order to power the city of LA, we had to build infrastructure. We had to build billion-dollar power plants like Kathy was talking about, usually powered by coal or nuclear. And we had to build even more billions of dollars worth of transmission and distribution lines. And so in order to do that, you have to socialize those costs, give a regulated monopoly away to a utility, set prices by the government, all these things that capitalists don't like, right? But now we're at a point where that's not even relevant anymore. The minimum scale for efficiently delivering electricity to this building is not billions of dollars. It's thousands of dollars.
What does that mean for utilities and all the people who buy utility stocks and buy utility, right? What's that mean for utilities?
The utilities, I mean, this is a well-documented thing. Utilities are in what some people have called a death spiral. I think it's just a change spiral. They have to figure out a new business model in order to manage the resources that they have and the resources they need to have more effectively, right? And they have not had the incentive to do so because they are regulated and they have all sorts of other market imperfections that cause us not to see the most efficient outcome, right? But it is absolutely the case the utilities are adapting today. Initially, they were adapting by defending their territory. Now they're engaging, not so productively if you're the renewable industry.
Some are still defending, yeah.
But,
So there's work that you might find of interest that's on this subject that we're doing at Stanford, and I've got a bunch of very, very clever graduate students, and they have built a model that we were calling hotspots. And here's the idea, that almost every utility in this country has a part of their grid, their distribution system, that's constrained. In the old way, what you would do is if you were an engineer, you saw that you were like getting too hot in some summer afternoons, oh boy, Fred, we need to put some more wire through here. Interestingly now, you don't simply have to build more pipe in that'll bring power from a long way away in the desert or from some hydro facility or from some nuclear plant up the coast. Instead, you can say, well, actually, it's just this little pocket that's constrained. What about meeting that demand by a combination of things downstream of that congestion point? Why don't we look at the cost of adding distributed solar, plus some energy efficiency, plus some storage maybe, plus some demand response? How will that stack up? So my graduate students had built this model that we're making an open source tool. It'll be available at the end of this spring quarter. And so that anybody in any utility or anybody selling a technology can basically populate this model and figure out what's the most cost-effective solution for this particular place. But I tell you, the conversations we've had with utilities are like, oh gosh, we better start thinking this way. But we are in the midst of that transition, and so when we're looking not only at the technology aspects of this, but the economics, because the utilities, if they're going to not be in a death spiral, but in a change spiral, they're going to have to figure out how to charge money, make money. Do they keep it on their books? Do they rent the equipment? How do they do that? Do they incent their householders to put solar on, or do they buy the solar panels and rent the roof space from their customers? Any of those models could probably work, but we want the utilities to be on the team having the conversation about how you can make it work.
Right, they become some kind of combination of eBay and UPS, some intermediary market delivery service, not in the sort of generation, not in the generation business. At least two of the three secretaries we just heard have talked about a price on carbon as necessary to make, to drive some innovation. So let's talk a little bit about that. Ian, would a price on carbon help Wrightspeed sell cleaner trucks to?
It'll make electricity a lot more expensive. It'll make fuel more expensive. It's a wash. It won't do anything to the batteries. You've got to be careful of unintended consequences when you mess with that stuff.
It will make electricity coming from fossil fuel more expensive, but if it's
that's most of it.
Most of it depends on where you are. But most of the country, not so much Northern California.
Yeah,
price
most
on
of the country, yes.
Kathy, price on carbon?
Absolutely. I mean, we absolutely need a price on carbon. But look, all of the policy instruments we have in place now, the incentive programs, the investment tax credit, that's a proxy for a price on carbon. Essentially what we're doing is we're sort of saying there's a shadow price. We want to reward the things that emit carbon less, so we create this other incentive pool. The most efficient way wouldn't be to have an economy-wide price on carbon if it were set at a level sufficient enough to change behavior. It's just, that's politically challenging. I mean, if a cap and trade thing can work as well. Lots of buckets of incentives and penalties can work well too. There's a whole variety of policy instruments that can achieve that objective, but you've got a bunch of really interesting conservative political leaders in this country that are advocating for a carbon tax, a revenue neutral carbon tax. That is a fascinating conversation that I hope all of us are excited to get involved in.
George Schultz and others.
Yes.
I'd like to underscore one point that Kathy just made, which is that there's a major if in the carbon price debate, which is if it's set at a point that changes behavior. And there is no policy that's been proposed, not in the U.S. with Waxman-Markey or McCain-Lieberman or anything else that's ever been on the table in the U.S., and there's never been a price contemplated anywhere outside the U.S. that actually changes behavior in a meaningful way in the short term. So if you care about climate change, which is why most people care about a carbon price, you're going to be sorely disappointed if we get a carbon price because it's not actually going to solve the climate problem. So I'm going to take a slightly contrarian view, which is that yes, I would love a carbon price because I'd like to see a level playing field, and some of these proxies for a carbon price actually, we're still not really putting a carbon price in place when you have more subsidies for fossil fuels than you do for clean fuels. So I'm all for a carbon price, and I think gradually we'll get to a point where behavior changes. But unfortunately, from a climate standpoint, we need a lot more change a lot more quickly than any carbon price will ever get us. So don't be fooled into thinking that's the magic silver bullet.
Has California's carbon price of about $10 a ton done anything? Except make some people feel good and say, hey, we did it?
It's too low to really change behavior. I don't know even if it's changing behavior at the margins. I actually haven't seen the data.
I think what it does is it changes, and I've had this conversation with some policy wonk colleagues recently about the Clean Power Plan versus a carbon tax. What it does is it changes the investment behavior. It puts the damper on making big capital investments in carbon emitting technologies. Does it change what gets dispatched on the margin? Not as much.
But so it's important. I mean, I think you're right, exactly. And but most of the fossil fuel companies, even the worst ones that we all love to hate, have a price on carbon in their models. They did that years ago, right? It's not high enough.
Well, some of them are up to $80. It's pretty darn, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we saw the internal modeling, from a very interesting perspective when we were starting to help people think about pricing carbon. But it was, what I think people don't really realize is that pretty much every energy-related company has a carbon price internally baked into every single capital investment decision that they make. You can debate what level it should be at. Frankly, it's all too high relative to the current policy environment. They're not getting paid for that carbon price that they're putting in there, but they do have it.
It's kind of funny money. We're going to go to audience questions in a minute, but I want to touch on China a little bit. We heard, obviously, Secretary Paulson just talk about that. China's known as a place that doesn't innovate. They sort of copy. They drive down costs. They do all sorts of things. We've heard that the U.S. is not innovating as much as it should in this area. Is there innovation going to come out of China?
China is where a good chunk of the innovation is happening. And if you expand China to places like Korea and Japan, Singapore, in energy and resources, they're sort of more attuned, it seems, to the need for these technologies to continue to develop and scale up. but primarily for their own consumption. I mean, China has not only the largest consumption of renewable energy, but the largest production of renewable energy. They're just big, and they're building, I think it is 50 cities the size of Chicago in the next 10 years, from scratch. They don't even exist on the map today. 50 cities the size of Chicago in the next 10 years. You got to be a little bit more thoughtful about the resources you use to build those cities, right? So
the Paulson Institute is working on that, building efficiency standards. Yeah, the lock-in, how China urbanizes is going to have a big impact. Kathy Zoe, are you going to be spending some time in China?
I will probably be spending less time in China, but my colleagues at SunEdison spend a huge amount of time in China. I mean, SunEdison manufactures in China, has large power plant contracts in
But
China.
is it an innovative place, or is it just a place for implementation and scale and driving down costs?
I would say that my colleagues would argue that it is truly innovative. And I remember having a conversation with Secretary of Energy Steve Chu, whose parents were educated in China. He was educated in the United States, but when he did maybe his first or second trip to China, and I think maybe to a couple of the big Tsinghua University or some of the big universities, he came back and said, "Oh my gosh, look out, American innovation."
they have the most advanced high voltage transmission lines in the world. They have the most advanced batteries in the world. They did it themselves. I mean, sure, we all benefit from market-based recombinations, but it's absolutely the case that they own a lot of the most innovative stuff that we use today. Superconductors you talked about, they're ahead of the curve on that stuff too.
The infrastructure is certainly better in China. The roads are better in China. Ian, do you have any thoughts on China's role, innovator or implementer?
In my little piece of the world, no, we don't use Chinese batteries. The best ones come from Detroit or Japan. And we don't actually get any innovation for any of the stuff we do, which is a pretty broad range of technology in what we make from China. But they're, I think, very innovative in figuring out how to get high volume production ramped up very fast and at very low cost.
Remember when Buffett invested in BYD? We all thought that was going to be the killer thing. Let's go to include our audience questions. Do we need to use the microphone? Sure. Right here.
It seems that...
Please let us know who you are.
My name is Christopher Eichler. How are you? It seems a little contradictory. On the one hand, you say you have a superior product in solar, and then you want an artificial carbon tax. Isn't really the nirvana is Tesla just made a better car, and maybe even used, to your point, the electricity makes it a better driving experience for most people. So talking about a carbon tax seems almost what hurt the solar industry at the beginning, which Germany, all of these countries had these very expensive incentives to do solar, and then one day they run out of money, and the business models are all screwed up. It seems that the private sector fixes it, and the government gets in the way.
Unless solar is different than some of the other sectors.
I mean, the government has a really important role to play in setting the rules of the game. And in energy and resources, the government has always been playing that role, and it always will. Like, you'd be crazy if you told me that the government's going to get out of energy or food or water. So you have to just know the government's going to play a role, and you have to hope that the role that they play is a productive one. I'm one who believes we should get all of these subsidies, fossil and renewables, out of the game. Let us compete on equal footing, and I love our side of the curve, and I hate to be on the other line, right?
Right here. And then here.
On the question, my name is Gary Davis. On the question of solar cells, what's coming down the pike in terms of new technology? Because space is a real issue, and I would pay more than 2 times the current price for a solar cell for something that's 2 times more efficient, just to conserve space.
People have been bumping up against that 20% efficiency.
One of my former colleagues from Australia, Martin Green, you probably know, is a researcher at the University of New South Wales, and when I was first getting into this many years ago, he was known as a Chuck Yeager of solar because he broke the proverbial sound barrier, which had been 20% conversion efficiency. In January, he broke another sound barrier. He got over 40% of conversion efficiency, and he's doing this by a combination of new nanomaterials and then layering. So what he does is he gets to your point. Basically, you can get like somewhere between 2 and 3 times the output with the same amount of square footage. So he's in the lab right now, but I think again the time to market is shortening as well. So be looking for increases in efficiency, in the marketplace sometime in the next couple of years to that level. It's good stuff.
To throw some water on that, though, those new technologies have never been bankable. And that's why we're still using crystalline silicon.
This is crystalline silicon, Scott.
Well, but let me just finish. We had lots of different attempts at crystalline silicon over the last 10 years that didn't get banked because the financial markets didn't think it was sufficiently de-risked. And unless it gets banked, it doesn't get built, right? And so I would love to see continued advances in solar, but I think we have to be realistic about the time frame. And unless someone like Solar City or SunEdison, who have huge market power, choose to deploy something new with their own balance sheet backing up the performance claims and the necessary other performance wraps that banks need, we're not going to see a lot of really advanced solar technology come online for a while they figure out how to be banked and de-risked.
A lot of that thin film stuff. Yes, sir. Never played out.
David Fung from Vancouver. We have a factory in China with 3 million square feet manufacturing space. We cover the whole roof with solar panels. 1 million square feet of solar panels, generating 3 times the amount of power that we need. And China has now launched in this whole program of saying that all the 5 major power companies, if they're going to build any coal-fired power plant, 20% of it has to be renewable. So the policy has an impact. And right now, the program is going on to cover factory roof with solar panels. You remember Secretary Chu said, if we would paint all the factory roofs white, we don't have a climate change issue. So China goes one step further. Instead of painting it white, they're going to cover it with solar panels. And go in such a scale, the cost is coming down so dramatically. So I just would like to ask you if you have what you're thinking about this dual aluminum ion battery, which it can charge 1,000 times faster than the lithium ion battery, and how that will maybe changing the game.
Game changing on charging.
Oh, there's already
Different chemistries.
there's already batteries you can charge very, very fast, and they're quite reliable. You can do that, and they still have 10-year life in a vehicle. So that problem is basically solved. It's infrastructure for fast charging is why you don't do it. It's not because the batteries can't do it.
So cost and infrastructure. Yeah, let's have it right here, and then we'll get
Carl Domino from Florida. I guess my question is this: given the fact that battery technology may or may not improve, but it's been very slow, is there a limit to how good solar technology can get? I mean, we know Moore's laws are driving the price down. We've heard for 10,000, but you can't do that unless you can tie into a grid. In our state, for example, if you have a solar, excess goes to the county, to the power company to get paid for it. But more importantly, if there's some dark periods, you get it. So without battery technology developing, can solar continue on the curve it's had?
Yeah, I think battery technology will develop. I mean, the systems that my future colleagues in SunEdison are deploying right now, where there's battery backup, they're using old technology. They're using lead acid. The next set of systems that we deploy are going to be lithium ion, and then we'll continue to actually just slot in more and more efficient ones. And it turns out that again, it's still paying its way even with the old-fashioned batteries. So when you're having a microgrid situation, I'm not a huge fan of the folks that say, no, I'm going to leave where there's a grid established, like in the United States. I'm going to leave the grid. I actually think that there's a lot of opportunities for grid balancing and everything else. I mean, here's an interesting case. Oak Ridge National Lab some months ago connected 3 of its rooftop air conditioning units, had its rooftop air conditioners talking to the solar panels that were on this commercial building, so that when a cloud went over, or when a cloud was about to come over and the voltage was going to drop, basically they would reduce the output in a de minimis way of those rooftop air conditioning units. Now, modern sensors and controls can allow us to do all that. So what we're talking about here is, again, dare I get lingo-y, but the Internet of Things of our energy technologies, all of these technologies are going to be able to talk to each other. So yes, battery banks are a part of the solution, but our need to rely on them is well overstated because there's so much other sort of give in the system that we haven't even harvested. But we've got 39% of households in America now have smart meters. That gives us the capacity to communicate in real time what the real needs are going to be, and to, with analytics, anticipate what those are going to be. So I'm not that worried about the battery stuff. I think it will come faster than he does. That's okay. Even if it comes as slowly as Ian thinks it's going to come, we're going to have a great system of solutions.
Amy, 5 minutes. We got 5 minutes. Yeah.
Amy Christensen Global Strategies. Just as we go to this increased deployment of solar, distributed generation of solar on rooftops, and as we go to increasing uptake of electric cars, the traditional tools to finance the infrastructure, so the gas tax and power prices, so you paid the utility and a certain amount of that went for upkeep of the grid. Those are going away. I live in Idaho, and our state legislature just passed additional $200 when you register an electric car because you're not paying that gas tax. How do you see those gaps being filled as we scale up these great solutions, but obviously we also have these infrastructure needs?
Who wants that one?
That's my business, but go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, I was just, I mean, we recognize that, and Generate Capital, the business we started about a year ago, was specifically designed to fill that gap. We believe that that world I talked about, where there's billions of dollars worth of infrastructure, centrally funded, centrally managed, regulated, et cetera, has given way to a world where you don't need that central management, central station sort of generation model, but you do need a capital market system that supports that more distributed infrastructure. So a bank can't underwrite a $10 million infrastructure project today. So where do you go? Do you go to a venture capitalist, private equity firm? You know, it's very hard to find capital for long dated assets because our capital is shorter and shorter term in its duration. And the banks have left the building. And so we saw this need to finance the resource revolution, the distributed energy ecosystem that you talked about. And we said, all right, well, we're going to be the bank. And so we built a balance sheet to be able to be a bank, to lend to or provide equity for those smaller scale infrastructure projects. We make a great return on our money. The customer saves money on day one, and the infrastructure gets built, so the project developers and the technology manufacturers are happy because they sell their projects. Why not? Why not?
Yeah, right next to you.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Delchad from Delchad Capital. We didn't talk about ITC, investment tax credit. Supposed to go away next year, right?
We had a big debate before. Did we talk about it? No, right? I said no.
Well, tell us what you think is going to happen. How is that going to affect the green energy sector?
I suspect that it will probably go away. I mean, just watching what's happened with the wind production tax credit over the past couple of years, and it's a giant mess. I know when I was an investor at Silver Lake, and we were looking to make investments in the solar space, and we did eventually make an investment in Solar City. What we were underwriting was the assumption that it would go away. So, and I think that was not uncommon. I think most investors now are conservatively running the numbers on these businesses with the assumption that it will go away and that costs will come down and that you can still make money. But I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know.
I think I heard your partners say that there's maybe some deal that goes away, but there's some movement on master limited partnerships that opens up some flows or capital. I don't know.
Well, I mean, so cheap capital is not a problem for the industry right now with yieldcos and other sources of cheap capital. But to the question of the ITC, like I said before, I'd rather just get all these subsidies out of the way. We can compete. Give it to me. Give me a fair playing field. I'll pick my team and I'll win. Right? And the ITC is just this like albatross, frankly. And we don't need it hanging around our legs. Now there will be a blip because a lot of the market will slow immediately while people correct and fix business models and fix financial models. But we have lots of utility scale solar projects that are being built right now here in the United States where they're producing power at a rate independent of the ITC that is lower than the alternative source of power. It's just better.
I think we got one last one. We're getting one quick last one. Up. Very last one.
I'm Brian Kessler from SBL Venture Capital. Brian Kessler from SBL
Fast.
Venture
We're
Capital.
getting the red card here from the referee.
Okay. Just two questions. So
No. One question. The referee with the red card.
There's
two questions.
Points. Hydrogen fuel cell versus batteries. What's the future of cars? Which way is it going? And how do you deal with the competitive situation of it?
Ian.
Yeah, okay. Hydrogen is not a fuel. There are no hydrogen mines. You have to make it. You either make it by electrolysing water with electricity, and if you put that electricity in a battery, you get 98% of it back. If you put it into hydrogen, put it through a fuel cell, compress it, store it, all that stuff, you get 25% of it back. So you throw away 3/4 of the energy to do that. or you get it by reforming natural gas. And if you do that, it's more efficient to burn the natural gas in an engine and drive the wheels with it, or burn the natural gas in a turbine engine and drive a generator and charge the battery. So it's a losing proposition from an energy efficiency point of view. Because there is no source of hydrogen, you have to make it. So it's a non-starter for vehicles.
We have to end it there. Remember, VCs don't matter.
All right.
Okay. All right. He said it. All right. Thanks,
That's
everyone.
tweeted.
Thank you.